Hi guys, and welcome to the Stephen King Sematary Club. Hi guys, welcome back to the Haunted Valley. I am filming at night, so I'm not sure if this is going to be usable. I might end up having to scrap some of this and, I don't know, re-record some or do some of this at later time. I don't know. But we have talked about the first 3 chapters of Salem's Lot. So, I'm sorry, the first 2 chapters of Salem's Lot in the prologue. That was it. So now we are on chapter 3, which is the Lot 1. Now this has a lot of mini subchapters in it, and it introduces us to the town and some of the people in the town. And I like it because Stephen King goes, he'll list a time and then he will tell you about an event happening, or he'll cover an entire little subchapter of a person. This is a great way to quickly introduce people. So it's through the course of a day, and we get to meet some people that we haven't met yet. Salem's Lot has a huge cast of characters, and that's one of the things that when they made the miniseries, they had to combine a lot of characters because there are so many. And I know that I'm sure when I first read it, it was hard to keep track of all of them. And Tim said the same thing when I had him read Salem's Lot. He wanted me to make a list of all the characters. We're not even going to cover all of them. We're just going to cover most of the main ones. At 4 a.m., we have the Griffin boys, Hal and Jack. They are at the dairy farm. They work at the farm. It's their family business. Jack is a little goody two-shoes kid, and Hal is kind of resentful and kind of a sullen boy. 4:30 a.m. we're introduced to Win Purinton. He's the milkman. 5:15 a.m. we meet Eva Miller, who is the widow who owns the boarding house where Ben is staying. And her boarding house is full of lots of old men. And a lot of them are mentioned by name, but we won't worry about naming all of them. At 6:45, Mike Ryerson, he's the cemetery groundskeeper, and he takes care of the 3 cemeteries in town, and it only lists the names of 2 of them. There's Harmony Hill and Schoolyard Hill Cemetery. The third one, have no idea what it is. In this chapter, he finds a dead dog on the spikes of the cemetery gate, and I'm gonna have to start keeping track of this because dead dogs are a huge theme running through Stephen King books. The dog that Mike Ryerson finds is Doc. He is a Cocker Spaniel, and he belongs to the milkman, the guy that we just met a few chapters back. So he is hanging on the cemetery gates at Harmony Hill. Mike has to actually physically lift him up and off the spikes, and he puts him in his truck and is going to take him into the police when he goes for his lunch break. At 9 a.m. we meet Weasel Craig, whose real name is Ed, and he is the town drunk. He was once a lover to Eva, the boarding house person. He lives in the boarding house, and he basically lives there rent-free. He does odd jobs for Eva. 10 a.m. we meet Richie Bodden, and he is a school bully, and he has a fight with Mark Petrie. And Mark is the kid from the prologue. So he is with the tall man, who is Ben Mears. So that's our introduction to Mark. He is kind of nerdy, slender, delicate. He's able to beat Richie in a fight only because he is more clever and he is agile. 11:15, we meet the town dump custodian, who is a hunchback, and his name is Dud Rogers. And his big thing is he likes to shoot rats that are at the dump, and he likes to burn the trash. So he has big trash burnings, and he really likes the fire. At noon, we are introduced to Larry Crockett. He is the real estate mogul who lives in town, and he kind of works in a crappy little office, and he is reminiscing about how about a year ago he sold the Marsden house and a laundromat, an old defunct laundromat, to a man named Richard Straker. And this guy bought the laundromat and the house, for $1 in some very shady business dealing. There was blackmailing. He had information on Larry Crockett that even his wife didn't know about. So there was like an underhanded theme to it. And despite the number of times I have read this book, I still don't exactly understand what the deal they made was. But anyway, apparently it was like a win-win deal, and Straker, he bought the laundromat to turn into a secondhand, an antique store kind of thing to run with his partner Kurt Barlow, and they were going to live in the Marsden house. So that's why he bought it, and his request for this deal is that Larry doesn't talk about it to anyone, and that if he needs certain favors, certain odd jobs done, that Larry will provide these services for him without any questions asked. And then at this moment, because we're at the noon hour, Larry's going to lunch, and he sees that the car is up at the Marsden house. So Straker is at the Marsden house at this time. So then we're introduced to some other people. There's Bonnie Sawyer and Corey Bryant. They are having an affair. Charlie Rhodes, he's the bus driver. Sandy McDougal, she has a baby Randy that she abuses, and she has a husband, Royce. I believe she got pregnant at a very young age, and Royce married her, and they probably shouldn't have gotten married, and she resents this baby, and that's a whole issue that will come up. 4:00 p.m., we see that Ben is in his boarding house room. He's getting ready for dinner at Susan's house. He's going to meet her parents. And he notices a car at the Marsden house. And he's talking about the Marsden house on page 101. It says, quote, "From here it was a perfect miniature, diminished to the size of a child's dollhouse. And he liked it that way. From here the Marsden house was a size that could be coped with. You could hold up your hand and blot it out with your palm." At 5 p.m., we meet Matthew Burke. He is a teacher, and I always get confused because his name is Jason in the movie. His name is Matt in the book. I don't know why they couldn't have kept his name as Matt. He's a teacher, and quote, "His fingers were permanently yellowed with chalk dust rather than nicotine, but it was still the residue of an addicting substance." And that's on page 103. So Matt Burke also sees the car parked in the Marsden driveway. So everyone is just noticing, because there hasn't been a car there in so long. Now there is one. Everyone is paying attention to it. And he even says, quote, "He had been teaching in Salem's lot since 1952, and he had never seen a car parked in that driveway." That's on page 104. At 6 o'clock, Ben has dinner at Susan's house, and he meets her parents, Bill and Ann Norton. Susan is worried that her parents won't like him, but her dad seems to take an instant liking to Ben. And I love this description. It says, quote, "An odd communication seemed to pass between the two women who bore a strong resemblance to each other. Ann Norton's brow contracted while Susan's smoothed out. A load of worry seemed to have been transferred across the room by telepathy," on page 106. And I just really like that because Anne, I think, was counting on her husband being an ally and not liking Ben. And then she was very concerned because he took immediately to Ben. So it was 2-1, not in her favor, because Susan and her father, Bill, like Ben, and Anne is now the only one who doesn't like him. 7:30 p.m., Danny and Ralphie Glick take a very creepy, chilling walk through the woods. They're walking to Mark Petrie's house to go see his monster collection, and they took a back road, like through the woods shortcut, and they hear noises and they see glowing eyes, and it's very, very spooky. At 9 p.m. we meet Mabel Wirtz. She's 74 years old, and she pretty much spends her entire time sitting, spying in the town with her binoculars and calling people or listening on the party line to people talk about stuff. And she is, quote, a repository of town history and town gossip, and her memory stretched back over 5 decades of necrology, adultery, thievery, and insanity. That's on page 117. And also on page 117, quote, she simply lived in and for the town. In a way, she was the town. So there's this dark figure standing at the Harmony Hill Cemetery, waiting until it turns midnight. And he speaks out loud, saying, quote, "O my father, favor me now. Lord of flies, favor me now. Now I bring you spoiled meat and reeking flesh. I have made sacrifice for your favor. With my left hand I bring it. Make a sign for me on this ground, consecrated in your name. I wait for a sign to begin your work." And then there's a little bit more, and then it says, there was no sound, but that brought on the breeze. The figure stood silent and thoughtful for a time. Then it stooped and stood with the figure of a child in his arms. I bring you this. It became unspeakable. So, a little human sacrifice there. Maybe a child-sized human sacrifice. And then next we have chapter 4, which is titled Danny Glick and Others. So Ralphie is missing, and there's a huge multi-day search party. Danny, the brother, the one who came back from the woods, he's sick and he's admitted to the hospital. Straker calls and asks Larry Crockett to have people pick up some boxes for the store and the house at a shipping dock, and Larry Crockett sends Hank Peters and Royal Snow, and they are supposed to go and get these boxes. They're going to bring everything to the store except for one box. It's a really huge, big, creepy box, and they take it to the store, and they're supposed to lock it with a padlock, and then they take the big box to the house, and it's supposed to go down in the cellar, and then they're supposed to leave all the keys to 5 padlocks on the table downstairs in the cellar, and then padlock the front door, the back door, the shed, and I think the cellar door, and then of course the one that was in town in the shop. So they arrive at the house and it's dark. They did the store first. They arrive at the house and it's dark, and they're kind of creeped out because, you know, the Marston house is the spooky haunted house of the town, and they are so afraid they don't want to unload the box in the cellar. So there's a great quote. It says, "But childhood was beyond them, and they were incapable of going back with the job undone because of irrational fear. How would they explain it in bright daylight?" That's on page 139 to 140. So they get the box downstairs, and they're both really keyed up, really freaked out, and they realize they didn't put the keys down there. So they flip a coin to see who has to go down, and Hank loses. So he goes down there, and as he's walking through the cellar, he notices a kid's shirt and jeans and a shoe. And he remembers that that's pretty much what Ralphie Glick was wearing when he disappeared. So he throws the keys on the table and he books it, and they go back to Larry and they get paid for their job and whatnot. And then Hank kind of hangs back and talks to Larry, and he tells him what he saw. And Larry, who is supposed to in essence, protect Straker and Barlow, he kind of gently persuades / blackmails Hank into doubting what he saw. Pretty much saying, well, you didn't see a body, and, you know, a whole bunch of unsavory things could come out if you go to the police with this. So at this point, Ralphie has been missing for more than a week. Parkins Gillespie goes to talk to Ben Mears, and he goes to talk to Straker, because they are new in town, and he's a little suspicious and needs to check them out. And at the very end of this chapter, Danny Glick is found dead in his hospital room. 12-year-old boy, just dead. And his brother is still missing. They don't know what happened to him, but they're pretty sure he must be dead at this point. So now we are at chapter 5, which is Ben 2. Ben has found out that 4 children disappeared from 1928 to 1939, which is while Hubie and Bertie lived in the Marsden house. And he's talking to Susan, and he says, quote, "I think that house might be Hubert Marsden's monument to evil, a kind of psychic sounding board, a supernatural beacon, if you like." That's on page 176. And he's worried that this evil house might either cause possession in people who experience it, or it could not lure, but it could attract evil people, and that scares him more than the idea of possession. So Ben goes out to Dell's Tavern that night on the outskirts of town, and that's where he meets Weasel Craig, and he knows him from the boarding house. He ends up sitting with him, and then Matt Burt comes in, and he knows Weasel, so the 3 of them are hanging out together. And Matt and Ben are talking about his latest book, and Matt asks if he is writing about the Marsden house, because town gossip kind of says so. And there's a little thing, Ben has a thought. Quote, "Ben suddenly had an uncomfortable image. Here is a fish swimming around comfortably and, he thinks, unobtrusively, flicking here and there amongst the kelp and the plankton. Draw away for the long view, and there's the kicker. It's a goldfish bowl." That's on page 185. So Ben thought that he was being so secretive and playing it close to the chest, and, you know, all this gossip is still going around. It kind of freaks him out because he thought he had been undetected. Chapter 6, The Lot 2. So the 28th of September, Danny Glick is buried in Harmony Hill Cemetery, and Father Donald Callahan presides over the service, and this is our first introduction to him. During the funeral, Tony Glick, the dad, jumps into the grave, and he has to be hauled out by a whole bunch of men, which is scandalous, and Mabel Wirtz is watching that, and she's kind of excited. After the funeral, Mike Ryerson fills in the grave, and as he's doing it, he feels like he's being watched by Danny. So he opens the coffin, and, quote, "The eyes were open, just as he had known they would be, wide open and hardly glazed at all. They seemed to sparkle with hideous life in the last dying light of day." That's on page 209. And then the sun sets, and we don't exactly know what happened, but yet we do know what happened because vampires. The FBI calls Parkins Gillespie and gives him a rundown on Ben Mears, Kurt Barlow, and Richard Straker. So Ben Mears, the only thing about him is he's been in some protests, and he was investigated for a motorcycle accident that killed his wife, Miranda, in 1973 in New York. So now we know a little more about what happened with Ben's wife. Kurt Barlow, it was German-born. He fled to England in 1938. There's no birth date on record for him. Interesting. And the FBI agent said he's probably in his 70s. And then R.T. Straker is British-born, and he's 58 years old. Dud Rogers meets Barlow in the dump. Barlow has been... People keep saying that he is on a buying trip. He's not in town. So Dud actually meets him in the dump. He's come and watched the fire. He talks to Dud a little bit, and then he bites Dud, turns him into a vampire. Father Callahan, we go back to him. He has become a drunk over his last few years, and there is a quote, here we go, on page 229. "You could educate your hand not to be aware of the bottle's lessening weight." So his was like a gradual drinking too much. And he kind of struggles with his role in the world. He wants to fight real evil without any of the kind of bureaucratic political attachments to the issues. So that's his big thing. He wants to fight evil. Chapter 7 is Matt. And this is the last chapter we're going to cover in this segment. So Ben and Matt have dinner at Matt's house, and they're discussing how they should take Susan, and the three of them should go up to the Marsden house as like a welcoming party and investigate the new neighbors kind of thing. And then Matt goes out to Dell's, the little bar, and he runs into Mike Ryerson, and he thinks that Mike is on heavy drugs because Mike just looks awful. And Mike says that he got sick after the funeral, and he doesn't even remember filling in Danny's grave, and he doesn't know what's wrong with him. It's not drugs. And so Mike is just beside himself, and Matt invites him to his house to sleep, and then he's going to take him to the doctor the next day. So in the middle of the night, Matt hears Mike invite something into his house, and Matt is too afraid to go check and see what it is. Quote, "And in the awful heavy silence of the house, as he sat impotently on his bed with his face in his hands, he heard the high, sweet, evil laugh of a child, and then the sucking sounds." That's on page 254. Have a spooky day.